From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The issue of abortion has been a political winner for Democrats ever since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022. But will that prove to be the case this election? Republicans are beginning to address the issue, and the Democratic response suggests the left is a bit worried about whether abortion's political power is waning. Welcome to Potomac Watch. I am Kim Strassel, and with me to discuss this hot-button topic today are my colleagues Alicia Finley and Mene Ukwe-Barua. Democrats have campaigned on abortion very effectively ever since the court's Dobbs decision, which sent the issue of abortion back to the states. In the 2022 cycle and in off-year and special elections and in state initiatives that have been held on abortion, Democrats have been very effective at using it to keep voter attention on that subject, to divert attention away from issues like inflation or the border, and to paint Republicans as very extreme on abortion and intent on taking away women's reproductive rights. And they've done very well with it. But we are seeing a little bit of a shift this year. We've got more Republicans that are moving to the middle on this, but also more Republicans leaning in on it, willing to talk about it, to state their positions, and to try to reassure voters. And just an example of that, let's listen to Donald Trump talking about this not long ago.
So I think 6 weeks, you need more time than 6 weeks. I've disagreed with that right from the early primaries. When I heard about it, I disagreed with it. At the same time, the Democrats are radical because the 9 months is just a ridiculous situation.
Alicia, what are you seeing out there on the campaign trail? It strikes me that Trump is not alone in leaning in on this, trying to reassure people. I've seen more Republicans willing to talk about this out on the stump. They have different positions depending on their district. They're coming out with different messages. But what's striking to me is that they're actually talking about it and trying to get ahead of the issue. Is that just me, or are you seeing people out there talking about it as well, too? And what do you think accounts for this shift in their willingness to embrace it?
Well, I think you're seeing that in part because Democrats have pounded them for the last couple of elections. I mean, particularly in 2022, after the Dobbs decision came down on the issues, and running from it really didn't help them. So now they're trying to at least state what their position is. Even if I'm pro-life, I support exceptions for rape, incest, etc. Many of them are also actually saying that they're unabashedly pro-choice. And you'll hear about this, and actually there's a California district, and I don't know if it's considered a swing district. It could potentially be if it's a really good Republican year. Orange County, where you have a Republican candidate, Matt Gunderson, who's running against an incumbent Democrat, and he's actually putting his family out there. His daughter's talking about his support for women's rights and their women's rights to have an abortion. And you're seeing this from some other candidates. You're having male candidates have their wives and daughters talk about the issue just because perhaps they think it lends them more credibility on it, but they're not running from it like they were in 2022, because I think they realize that just allows Democrats to put them on defense and distort their position.
Yeah, and to define them. And I think that they're tired of being defined. And yet, here's the interesting thing is the more Republicans are out there talking about this and stating their own positions for the record, the more we are seeing Democrats try to distort those positions and still trying to define their Republican opponents in ways that simply aren't true. One really interesting example of this, I think that just sums it up, Tim Walz in the recent vice presidential debate last week said that Republicans support, quote, a registry of pregnancies, end quote. And this was no oops. Mr. Walz had made a claim very similar just last month. He said that, quote, Donald Trump is trying to create this new government entity that will monitor all pregnancies to enforce their abortion bans, end quote. And the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, it's running variations of that themes and ads that are accusing House Republican candidates of wanting to allow state governments to track pregnant women to prosecute them if they get an abortion, end quote. Now, I have to say, when I first started reading this, I was certainly surprised. I had never heard of such a registry. Mene, where does this claim come from? Does it have any basis basis in reality or fact?
I think it would be generous to say that it has any basis in reality or fact. The origin of it is Project 2025, which will be familiar to our listeners by now. This is the Heritage Foundation project that was purporting to put together policies for a future Trump administration. Of course, Trump himself was not behind the creation of Project 2025 and ultimately disavowed it. But Democrats have made a lot of hay out of saying that these are the plans that Trump will implement if elected to office. One of the provisions in Project 2025 was essentially creating more gathering of statistics across different states and cities so that there would be better information at the national level about how many abortions are taking place and other statistics of that kind. This wasn't a registry at all that they were envisioning. It was not going to have the names of the women who received abortions attached to the statistics. It was going to be generalized information of the sort that the government collects about all manner of things. But Democrats have seized on this and tried to paint pictures of everybody who ever goes in to get an abortion's name being collected, them being tracked, so that under some future regime where Republicans have succeeded in banning abortion nationwide, which of course is also a fantasy, that then those people would be potentially subject to prosecution. And so this is complete spin based on something that really was only about collecting information in the first place, but you now see it in ad after ad attacking Republicans as being behind a project to collect personal information about abortion.
Yeah, totally dystopian and wrong. And, my understanding as well, too, is that the reason it was proposed by Project 2025 was to actually get better statistics in an aid to sort of know about some of the difference between, for instance, abortions that are done purposely versus spontaneous miscarriages, also the use of abortion drugs and kind of the outcomes of those at times medically so that you can have a better sense of women's health. That's one good example of this. Here's another one that we're seeing, in particular in some Senate races. In Montana, Tim Sheehy has been very clear that he is pro-life, but he supports exceptions in cases of rape and incest in the life of the mother. And Tim Sheehy is obviously challenging Jon Tester, who is the Democratic senator from Montana. And Tester has just been outright misstating this, claiming that Sheehy doesn't support any exceptions in any case. It's almost a mirror situation in Pennsylvania where Bob Casey has been running ads. He's the Democratic senator there, claiming his Republican opponent, Dave McCormick, and I quote, wants to ban abortion even in the cases of rape or incest. And this has been quite remarkable given Mr. McCormick's position. And interestingly, he's come out with an ad to try to set the record straight. Let's listen to that.
I'm Dave McCormick. I approve this message. Have you seen this ad from Bob Casey?
No exceptions for rape or incest.
He knows it's a lie. I believe any abortion law should make exceptions for rape, incest, and when the life of the mother is endangered. I said it here, and here, here, here. I'm not for either extremes. I'm not for a national ban on abortion. I'm not for eliminating the 3 exceptions. Everywhere. Bob Casey thinks lying will win him another term. I think Pennsylvanians are smarter than that.
So, Alicia, this just really is striking to me because, look, what else is McCormick supposed to do, right? I mean, he's come out and he said, this is my clear position, and you're running an ad the other way around. Now, at least in Montana, I would note that the fact checkers, the infamous fact checkers, have come out and they did actually go after Jon Tester and say, this is a false claim. But we're seeing this in a lot of places. And I guess my question for you is, the McCormick response seems right to me to try to set the record straight. But when you have people that are just outright misstating it, I mean, are voters going to believe this? How effective is it going to be to just distort your opponent's record?
Well, I think that you're right that McCormick is doing the right thing to put out this ad and actually point to all the examples in which he actually said the opposite, and that Casey is purposefully and intentionally lying. And I think that actually could raise questions in voters' minds about what else Democrats are lying about. I think they really have a credibility the problem in this election. And we could go off back to how they kind of lied and fudged about Joe Biden's competence, but on a number of issues. And if they overstate these attacks or their positions on certain things, I think that's going to undermine their own arguments. I mean, I would just raise also the example of they're saying that Republicans want to prosecute women who get abortions, but I don't believe in any state, or there was actually a legislation the House Republicans put forth several years ago that would have basically stated life begins at conception. They all provide immunity to the women. They would not allow prosecution of the women. Usually would be the medical provider. And so they are just whipping women up or trying to scare them. And I think that this actually could have potential health consequences for women who are worried that, if they get an abortion or if they come, I mean, we can talk about this a little more. If they go to a hospital and seeking emergency care, will they be prosecuted? And is this deterring them from actually going to hospitals if they have side effects from using mifepristone, the abortion pill? I think Democrats are really doing a disservice to women.
Yeah, I want to come back and touch on that subject. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more on Democrats' abortion distortions. Welcome back. I'm here with Alicia Finley and Monet Ukwe-Barua talking about abortion in the 2024 election. Just in terms of approaches Democrats are taking to Republicans and some of these distortions, here's one more that I think is a little bit sneaky, and it's the suggestion that a Republican opponent is somehow, in some mystical way, going to end up playing a role in banning abortion in the state that they are campaigning in, even though they don't really have that ability whatsoever. To get an example of this, let's listen to an ad from Democrat Mondaire Jones. He is challenging the Republican House incumbent Mike Lawler in New York's 17th district.
Republicans in Congress won't stop until there's a national abortion ban. That would end abortion even here in New York.
Our congressman, Mike Lawler, has one of the worst records on abortion.
I can't trust him. He wants to control our healthcare decisions.
He's putting women's lives at risk.
Lawler empowers the worst people in Washington. Their platform would ban abortions even here in New York without exception for rape or incest. So we have to stop this guy. I'm Mondaire Jones, and I approve this message.
So, Monet, a couple of things here. One, it's notable that Republicans actually took out of their platform this year at their convention a call for a national abortion ban. And in fact, their decision to not include it produced some blowback from some pro-life groups. Not a big one, not a huge fuss, but they certainly weren't very happy about it. But the thing that really strikes me is something you mentioned earlier, that this fiction of a national abortion ban or of Lawler having any ability to influence New York. I mean, can you give us the chances that New York is going to ban abortion anytime soon, regardless of what Mike Lawler has to say about it?
Right. So I think that the attack on Lawler in that Mondaire Jones ad has two really big and really, frankly, very obvious lies in it. The first regards Mike Lawler himself, who was elected as a moderate Republican and has always said that he was very much not in favor of advancing restrictions on abortion. He knows that the state he represents, New York, has one of the more permissive laws in the country, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. And so he himself is a particularly moderate candidate who, if anything, if he went to Washington, would be a check on some of the more pro-life inclined members in the Republican Party. But more broadly than that, the Republican Party as a whole, as you mentioned, has really backtracked quite a lot from the more pronouncedly pro-life stances that it had before the Dobbs ruling. And that's because this is the second consecutive election cycle where Democrats have really been able to succeed by attacking Republicans' positions. And so not only have they removed national ban from their platform, but Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who, of course, are the heads of the Republican ticket and who would be in charge of setting the agenda for Republican policy in next presidential term, have really walked away from any embrace of a national ban. Donald Trump has explicitly renounced that. J.D. Vance, folks will remember from the debate, was talking all about how Republicans need to regain trust with voters on this issue because people think that the Republican Party historically has been out of step with what the median American voter wants from abortion policy. And so it really is a stretch by Democrats to continue trying to pin some of these positions on Republicans as the party has moved further and further away from going on offense in terms of advancing abortion restrictions at the national level.
Yeah. And of course, I think some of that is also driven by the fact, and this was a point that Nikki Haley made when she was in the presidential primary against Donald Trump, which is that unless you can get 60 senators in the U.S. Senate that all agree with the national abortion ban, it's never going to happen. It's been forever since Republicans have had anywhere near that many senators in the Senate. So it's just simply not an idea that is going to come to fruition in practice anytime soon, if ever. But I want to go back to, Alicia, to something you said about women's health. And look, politics isn't beanbag. We get it. And often there are false claims in elections. But it does strike me that this is a topic that has some further risks when you are outright distorting the state of existing laws or what your opponents want to do, in that, as you note, women might be discouraged from attempting to obtain urgent medical care for fear of some sort of repercussion that actually doesn't exist. And this gets to this very sad story that Democrats have been retelling a lot in the media about Amber Thurman, a 28-year-old woman who very tragically died. And Tim Walz brought this up again in the vice presidential debate. And here's how he described what happened. He said, Ms. Thurman, who lived in Atlanta, quote, had to travel a long distance to North Carolina to try and get her care, end quote. She was seeking an abortion because Georgia prohibits abortion after 6 weeks. And he said, quote, Amber Thurman died in that journey back and forth, end quote. We had a very good piece about this week from our own Nick Tomino and explaining kind of the very complex background of this story. But Alicia, what's the kind of broader story here about Amber Thurman?
Well, there are a lot of questions about what actually happened. What Tim Walz was referring to was a ProPublica piece, and as ProPublica is wont to do, it provides this narrative of this woman, very sympathetic story, who sought an abortion, couldn't get one in Georgia because of the state's law, and then went to North Carolina where she was prescribed mifepristone, the abortion pill. She was 9 weeks pregnant with twins, and because of the FDA regulations, you don't actually have to, if you receive mifepristone, actually have to stay at a medical provider's facility. You can actually go home right away. There aren't any required check-ins after that. The doctor, however, is supposed to inform you about potential side effects, what you should do. We should go to the emergency room if you have this and that happens. And she drove home only to experience some of these side effects. However, she delayed going to the emergency room. She did eventually. And there were some more delays in treating her, and she developed sepsis, life-threatening condition. And again, doctors did not intervene to provide what would usually be the required medical procedure, a D&C. And there were questions, well, why didn't they do it, or why didn't they do it sooner? And ProPublica's conclusion was they didn't do it because they thought it was banned by the state law, but there's no evidence in the story that that was the case. The law that Brian Kemp signed in 2019 actually defines abortion as an intended to cause the death of an unborn child with a detectable human heartbeat. But here it's pretty clear that the fetus was already dead. And the Georgia law also provided that doctors can provide immediate treatment when an medical emergency exists and a pregnancy is medically futile, which was the case here. I mean, my own supposition is what happened is that this hospital where she was treated, it's known as a community health center. And that means they primarily treat low-income patients who are uninsured. They're usually not great facilities. So if you have an emergency, you usually don't want to go to one of these healthcare centers. And I would suppose that, well, maybe it's just because they were under-resourced. If you look at the reviews on both actually Google or Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the hospital gets atrocious ratings in terms of timely treatment of patients. And it actually has the CMS website shows them only about 40% of patients with sepsis get appropriate care. It's about 60% nationwide. So I would think that, well, maybe the problem was just the hospital. It just screwed up. It didn't provide the appropriate treatment. And maybe we should be investigating why there was these delays. Is it because the hospital is underfunded? Is it because Medicaid underpays providers so they can't provide enough resources to care for all these patients? I think that's actually the bigger story. But Democrats, as usual, want to put everything into their own facile narrative of that, well, these state laws are endangering women. And the unfortunate result is that many women are going to be afraid to go to these emergency rooms because, well, maybe they'll die then, as happened in this case.
Yeah, I think that's really the point here, is that if you dig into this story, as Alicia just outlined very well, there's a lot of confusing questions here about the use of mifepristone, her decision not to go to the hospital for a while and why that was, the quality of the hospital, perhaps confusion over this law among medical providers, although that shouldn't necessarily be the case given the clear lettering of the law.